Recording.
There we go. Unmute your mic, man. Unmute your mic, Mike.
There we go.
Okay, good. Yeah, we're on 37. You want to start off? Happy New Year, by the way.
You as well. Give me 1 second. Okay. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Kama Isha Karura Isha, Raja Guna Samud Baba, Mahashano Mahapapma, Ire Inam Iha Varina. Synonyms. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, Kama, lust, Isha, this, Krodha, wrath, Isha, this, Rajaguna, the mode of passion, Samudbhava, born of, Maha Ashana, all devouring, Mahapapma, greatly sinful, Vidi, no, Inam, this, Iha, in the material world, Varirnam, greatest enemy. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion, and later transformed into wrath, which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world.
Okay, we'll take turns reading paragraphs here because it's a long one.
Okay.
When a living entity comes in contact with the material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust in association with the mode of passion. Or in other words, the sense of love of God becomes transformed into lust, as milk in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt. Then again, when lust is unsatisfied, it turns to wrath. Wrath is transformed into illusion, and illusion continues the material existence. Therefore, lust is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and it is lust only which induces the living entity to remain entangled in the material world. Wrath is the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. These modes exhibit themselves as wrath and other corollaries. If, therefore, the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the mode of ignorance, is elevated to the mode of goodness by the prescribed method of living and acting, then one can be saved from the degradation of wrath by spiritual attachment. So that's reminds me of something Deva Amritaswamy, my mentor, used to say, that love of God is simply, or lust is simply love of God gone bad. Just like this sentence says, in other words, sense of love of God is transformed into lust, as milk in contact with sour tamarind is turned into yogurt. So that's probably where he got that little quote from. Go ahead.
The Supreme Personality of Godhead expanded himself into many for his ever-increasing spiritual bliss, and the living entities are parts and parcels of this spiritual bliss. They also have partial independence, but by misuse of their independence, when the service attitude is transformed into the propensity for sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. This material creation is created by the Lord to give facility to the conditioned souls to fulfill these lustful propensities, and when completely baffled by prolonged lustful activities, the living entities begin to inquire about their real position.
Yeah, hopefully they will. I mean, a lot of times they just engage in lustful activities and they become addicted to them and they never get out of it, you know. I guess when you're smashed enough, you hit rock bottom, you know, so to say, then you begin to question whether or not it's all worth it, you know. Like, you ever heard the story of Pingala, the prostitute?
I don't think so.
It's in the Bhagavatam. This prostitute was looking for patrons. She was out in the street for most of the night, and she finally became completely frustrated. And then she got a feeling of detachment. And then she started to, become really detached, and she actually surrendered to Krishna. She became a devotee. So I guess that's the process. When you're completely baffled, sometimes you become detached from your so-called enjoyment, and you begin to question why you're doing this and if there's a better way. And then when your intelligence shows you the better way, if you're sincere, then Krishna will guide you to take shelter of a devotee in Krishna consciousness. This inquiry is the beginning of Vedanta Sutra, wherein it is said, Atato Brahma Jignasa. One should inquire into the Supreme, and the Supreme is defined in Srimad Bhagavatam as Janmadhyaya Asyayaton Vayad Itarascha, or, quote, the origin of everything is the Supreme Brahman, end quote. Therefore, the origin of lust is also in the Supreme. Therefore, if lust is transformed into love for the Supreme, or transformed into Krishna consciousness, or in other words, desiring everything for Krishna, then both lust and wrath can be spiritualized. That's a good point. Not only lust, but wrath too. Hanuman, the great servitor of Lord Ram, exhibited his wrath by burning the golden city of Ravana, but by doing so, he became the greatest devotee of the Lord. Here also in Bhagavad-gītā, the Lord induced Arjuna to engage his wrath upon his enemies for the satisfaction of the Lord. Therefore, lust and wrath, when they're employed in Krishna consciousness, become our friends instead of our enemies. Of course, we have to be careful, because if we, think, oh, I'm such a great devotee, I'm going to chastise all these demons, we can become puffed up and use our own ego to smash all the enemies of Krishna consciousness by our logic and reason and argument, but we have to make sure that Krishna is satisfied and he's actually kind of impelling us to do this. We don't care if anyone attacks us personally, but if you attack Krishna or Krishna's devotees, then you can use anger in Krishna's service. Go ahead and read the next verse.
I guess this would come down to like motivation, like why you might want to choose to do something. If you're truly trying to please Krishna, then wrath or anger might be at times necessary. But if you're doing it out of, some perverted desire for your own enjoyment, then not so good. I guess because with Arjuna, he's really, finding out that Krishna wants him to do this. And so the only reason he would do this is because that's what Krishna wants, not because he feels any specific wrath towards, even the ones who wronged him. He still was more than ready to forgive, all of the.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't want to fight. He was looking for reasons not to fight because he was so attached to his family members, and he was a peaceful person. He was, it was all based on the bodily conception. But if you really listen to Krishna, and if he really kind of, let himself be guided by that principle, then he would probably remember, hey, they disrobed my wife in that assembly. I should probably get them back, and use that anger in Krishna's service, but only under the guidance of Krishna. I try not to do anything without, understanding Krishna. You can always pray at every moment to, let thy will be done instead of mine, you let go, let God, like that. But you also have to use your intelligence to find out what is the best way to use it in any given situation. So Krishna is dictating from within our hearts. And if we are sure of what he wants, then we can pray at the same time. If we know what he's asking, we can say, okay, Krishna, how is the best way? What's the best way for me to do this? Just like Arjuna in the middle of a battle, he has to, he wasn't asking Krishna at every moment, what should I do? Who should I kill next? He was actually using his own intelligence from within his heart, guided by the super soul. And so you have to, it's a moment by moment the thing, but once you're connected to Krishna, you can pray as well to use whatever is necessary. It's a utility is the principle. You can use wrath, you can use love, lust. The gopis use lust not for their own satisfaction, but for Krishna's satisfaction. You can use anger, you can use typewriters and dictaphones and missiles. Prabhupada said missiles. So, we don't have any missiles, but, I'm sure they could be used in the right situation. Everything can be used in Krishna's service. It's not like we're, everything has a utility. Prabhupada said utility is the principle. Purity is the fourth force. And so if we're pure, if we're connected to Krishna, and if we take guidance from him, then we become pretty much, it almost becomes like an autopilot after a while. Just like there's one verse from, I just posted it actually. Let me show it to you. It's, no, that's not it. This quote here. A spiritually advanced person is authorized to act as the spiritual master speaks, as the supreme personality of Godhead dictates from within. Thus, it is not that he is personally speaking. In other words, when a pure devotee or spiritual master speaks, what he says should be accepted as having been directly spoken by the supreme personality of Godhead in the Parampara system. So it's like once you are on that train, all you do is open your mouth. Jesus's disciples asked Jesus, well, what should we say, dear master? And he said, just open your mouth. It's just a matter of connecting. When Lord Chaitanya was speaking, asking questions of Ramananda Roy, he admitted that it was not, Ramananda Roy that was speaking. It was actually Lord Chaitanya was speaking through him. So Krishna we're just like dancing dolls. Krishna can make us do whatever wonderful thing we can. He has a very deep intention, and he's always way smarter than we are. So it's best to submit ourselves to his direction, using our transcendental intelligence and our, the best way to serve, because it's a process of service. So if you can guess what Krishna wants and you give it to him before he even asks, then that's even better. That's a first class devotee. Second class devotee does what he told, and third class devotee just does whatever the hell he wants, and uses it as service as an excuse for service. But if we want to become first class, then we have to just try to understand what Krishna wants and then do it. So yeah, go ahead and read.
Sure.
30.
Text 38. Tumena vriyate vanir yatha darsho malena cha yatho bena varto garbas tatha tena dama vratam. Synonyms. Numena, by smoke. Avriyate is covered. Vani, fire. Yatha, just as. Adarsha, mirror. Malena, by dust. Cha, also. Yatha, just as. Ulbena, by the womb. Avrita is covered. Garba, embryo. Tatha, so. Tena, by that lust. Idam, this. Avritam is covered. Translation. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, whereas the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust.
Go ahead and read the purport.
There are three degrees of covering of the living entity by which his pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under different manifestations, like smoke in the fire, dust on the mirror, and the womb about the embryo. When lust is compared to smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be a little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits his Krishna consciousness slightly, he may be likened to fire covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary where there is smoke, there is no overt manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of Krishna consciousness. The dust on the mirror refers to a cleansing process of the mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy names of the Lord. The embryo covered by the womb is an analogy illustrating a helpless position, for the child in the womb is so helpless that he cannot even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of the trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life by such a great exhibition of lust that they are almost void of all consciousness. The covered mirror is compared to the birds and beasts, and the smoke-covered fire is compared to the human being. In the form of a human being, the living entity may revive a little Krishna consciousness, and if he makes further development, the fire of spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke and the fire can be made to blaze. Therefore, the human form of life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy, lust, by cultivation of Krishna consciousness under able guidance.
Text 39. Amritam Gyanametena Gyaninan Nityad Varnina Vairinana Kama Rupena Konteya Dusparena Nalenacha. I always like that word, Dusparena Nalenacha. Synonyms. Avritam, covered, Gyanam, pure consciousness, Etena, by this, Gyanina, by of the knower, Nitya Vairina, by the eternal enemy, Kamarupena, in the form of lust, Konteya, the O son of Kunti, Dusparena, never to be satisfied, Analena, by the fire, Cha also. Translation. Thus, the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Purport. And it is said in the Manusmriti that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment, just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of fuel. In the material world, the center of all activities is sex. And thus this material world is called Maitunya Agara, or the shackles of sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within bars. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the law of God, of the Lord, are shackled by sex life. Advancement of material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of material existence of a living entity. Therefore, this lust is a symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. That's when you excuse me, when you what does it say? Nitya Vairnina, by the eternal enemy. That sounds like almost like a comic book villain, you know. They should make a comic book in Krishna consciousness and make it into like the eternal enemy of lust, you know. That would be like awesome, because it sounds pretty formidable. Go ahead.
Text 40. Indriyani mano budir asyadhishtanam uchyate tarir vimo heyati esha nanam avrtya dehinam. Synonyms. Indriyani, the senses, mana, the mind, buddhi, the intelligence, asya, of this lust, adhishtanam, sitting place, uchyate, is called, etai, by all these, vimo hayati, bewilders, esha, this lust, jnanam, knowledge, avrtya, covering, dehinam, of the embodied. Translation. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him.
All right, we'll take turns here. I'll read up to the, no, you read the first paragraph and I'll read the Sanskrit in the next verse.
Sure. Purport. The enemy has captured different strategic positions of the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places, so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all the activities of the senses, and thus, when we hear about sense objects, the mind generally becomes a reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification. And as a result, the mind and the senses become repositories of lust. Next, the intelligence department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligence is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with matter, and thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam 10:84-13.
Yeah, it seems to me like just expanding on this idea of like making into a comic book, You could have like the hero is like, you ever seen the diagram of the minds and senses, the souls riding on the chariot of the mind with the senses of the horses. And he's living in the city of 9 gates, which is the body, of course, the mind and the intelligence. And then this lust, this eternal enemy is like lurking in the mind and the senses. So, you know, you have to be, you could make a whole, you know, comic strip or like cartoon, or not a cartoon, but a, you know, graphic video based on that concept, you know, because it is, all these analogies are really instructive. You know, they're analogies. There's all kinds of preaching analogies, and the mind and intelligence are the sitting places of lust. And so you're the soul, who is the hero. He's going to go and conquer this eternal enemy. And so there always has to be a protagonist and an antagonist in any kind of battle, you know. And the Bhagavad-gītā itself is like that, but it's real, you know. But you could also make one, you know, that based on, you know, modern technology and everything like that. It would be kind of interesting to concept. I'll pitch it to George Lucas. You know, that's what he actually did. Somebody pitched him the Ramayana. He created Star Wars. You know that, right? Yeah. So anyway, Yasyatma Buddhi Kunapiti Ke Swadi Kalatadi Shuboma Yajadi Yatirta Buddhi Salile Nakarichit Yagneshu Abigneshu Swaiva Go Kara. This is an amazing verse. A human being who identifies this body made of 3 elements with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsmen, who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the place of pilgrimage simply to take a bath, rather than meet man of transcendental knowledge there, is to be considered like an ass or a cow. Go ahead.
Text 41. Tasmatvam indriyani adu niyama bharatasabam papmanam prajahi he enam jnana vijnana nashanam. Synonyms. Tasmat, therefore, tavam, you, indriyani, senses, adau, in the beginning, niyamya, by regulating, bharatara rishaba, O chief among the descendants of Bharat, Papmanam, the great symbol of sin, Prajahi, curb, hey, certainly, Inam, this, Jnanam, of knowledge, Vijnana, and scientific knowledge of the pure soul, Nashanam, the destroyer. Translation. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharats, in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization.
Okay, you can read the first paragraph, including the Sanskrit, and I'll read the second paragraph.
Okay. Purport. The Lord advised Arjuna to regulate the senses from the very beginning so that he could curb the greatest sinful enemy, lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization and specific knowledge of the self. Jnana refers to knowledge of the self as distinguished from non-self, or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnana refers to
It's actually Gyan and Vigyan. JN is pronounced Gyan. Vigyan, Gyan and Vigyan.
Gyan and Vigyan?
Yeah.
Okay. So Vigyan refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship to the supreme soul. It is explained thus in the Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.31. So that would be Gyan again.
Gyanam.
Gyanam. Param guyam me yad vigyan samanvitam sarashayam tad angam cha grahana garitam maya.
Yeah, go ahead and read the translation.
Knowledge of the self and supreme self is very confidential and mysterious, but such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord himself. Bhagavad-gītā gives us that general and specific knowledge of the self. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. So from the very beginning of life, one has to learn this Krishna consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly.
Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So from any stage of life, or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. Go ahead.
Text 42. Indriyani parani ahur, indriyebhya paramana, anasastu parabudir, yo budhe paratas tusa. Synonyms. Indriyani, senses, parani, superior, ahu, are said, indriyebhya, more than the senses, param, superior, mana, the mind, manasa, more than the mind, two, also, para, superior, buddhi, intelligence, ya, who, budhe, more than the intelligence, parata, superior, two, but, sa, he. Translation. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind, and he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence.
Okay, we'll take turns here, I guess. Purport: the senses are different outlets for the activities of lust. Lust is reserved within the body, but it is given vent through the senses. Therefore, the senses are superior to the body as a whole. These outlets are not in use when there is superior consciousness or Krishna consciousness. In Krishna consciousness, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the hierarchy of bodily functions, as described here, ultimately ends in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means the functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily activities. But since the mind is active, and even though the body may be silent and at rest, the mind will act as it does during dreaming. But above the mind is the termination of the intelligence, and above the intelligence is the soul proper. If, therefore, the soul is directly engaged with the Supreme, naturally all other subordinates, namely the intelligence, mind, and senses, will be automatically engaged. In the Katha Upanishad, there is a similar passage in which it is said that the objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses, and the mind is superior to the sense objects. Therefore, if therefore the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chance that the senses will become entangled in other ways. This mental attitude has already been explained. Param drishtva navartate. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord, there is no chance of its being engaged in the lower propensities. In the Katha Upanishad, the soul has been described as Mahan, the great. Therefore, the soul is above all, namely the sense objects, the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution to the whole problem. Good.
With intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. That solves the whole problem. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of the senses. But aside from that, one has to strengthen the mind by use of intelligence. If by intelligence one engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness by complete surrender under the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically the mind becomes stronger. And even though the senses are very strong, like serpents, they will be no more effective than serpents with broken fangs. But even though the soul is the master of intelligence and mind, and the senses also, still, unless it is strengthened by association with Krishna in Krishna consciousness, there is every chance of falling down due to the agitated mind.
Text 43. Evam buddhi param buddhva samstabhyatmanam atmana Jahi Satrum Mahabaho Kamarupa Darasadam. Synonyms: Evam, thus, Buddha, to intelligence, Param, superior, Budva, knowing, Samstabhya, by steadying, Atmanam, the mind, Atmana, by deliberate intelligence, Jahi, conquer, Shatrum, the enemy, Mahabaho, O mighty armed one, Kamarupam, in the form of lust, Durasadam, formidable. This is kind of neat, because it's like all internal battle, but before the real battle begins, Krishna is telling him to battle the battle that's going on inside him, trying to have him heroically defeat all the enemies within his own self, It's pretty cool. So it's like a battle before the battle. In order to have the battle, he's going to have to conquer the enemies that are within himself. In other words, his attachment to his bodily, relations, and obey the supreme soul, which is, who's driving his chariot. So if he takes instruction from him, then he'll conquer his enemies, no problem. Translation.
If he's able to conquer that enemy within, the person who can do that, any external situation would really be like child's play.
Any external, yeah. That the greatest kings, conquering the world is not a big deal. Conquering your senses is way better, way more, formidable enemy, because how many people actually can conquer their senses in this world? Everybody's a Godas, not a Goswami. Goswami means one who has controlled his senses. Godas means one who is a servant of the senses. So, it's actually a very rare situation to find somebody who can conquer his own senses and desires, his internal desires. That's what Krishna is actually asking Arjuna to do first, because I saw this one like little meme on I think it was by the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust or something by Śikṣāṣtaka Prabhu. It said it's like a spiritual GPS. First of all, number one, you have to find yourself, and then you can find where you're going. So in order to actually know where you're going and be successful in your journey, you have to first know who you are. And that's what Krishna is instructing Arjuna to do before he even embarks on his battle, So it's a lot of people put the cart before the horse. First, they do something out of habit or just because out of, to make money or whatever fruit of activity, or just out of lust. But, isn't it better to know who you are? Then you can probably make a decision as to what you should be doing, and then actually do it in a very intelligent and systematic way, based on intelligence and ultimately based on the soul. So I think we're on the synonyms, right? Yeah.
Translation.
Translation. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Oh my God, we're at the end. Go ahead.
So and it hasn't come up directly in the last couple verses or purports, but it seems like if we go back to some of the stuff from the last chapter, I believe, everything about Krishna consciousness really is Krishna's mercy, that we can make these efforts, but ultimately any progress we make is really due to the mercy of Krishna through either a spiritual master or pure devotee, something like that. It seems like that conquering lust and overcoming this once again would be something that you might want to do, try to do, struggle to do, but ultimately would still come down to Krishna granting you the ability to do that.
Well, Krishna says, this material energy of mine, very difficult to overcome, but one who surrenders to me can easily cross, beyond it's a great ocean of material energy, that we're controlled by. We're all controlled by the modes of nature, and the mind is controlled, and our intelligence is being pulled by the senses. So if we want to control our senses and mind, we just have to surrender. It's just basically kind of like the 12-step program. We're addicted to this material world. We're addicted to all our own programs for our own schemes to be happy, and we're trying to be happy in many ways. But if we just surrender to Krishna, then and obey his instructions, ultimately we'll understand that the way to be happy is not to try to satisfy these temporary senses, but to actually try to execute his order, surrender to his will, and then we'll be happy, because that will be satisfying to Krishna's senses. So, it's all based on what is the center of your existence. The center of your existence should be Krishna and not our own mind and intelligence and false ego and senses. So once you make that discrimination and you actually can surrender, just like we're reading here, these are Krishna's instructions. If you would understand Krishna's instructions with your mind and intelligence and try to act on them, not only here by reading, but also when in any given situation, you could always be, and once you're in contact with Krishna, you kind of like, it becomes a flow of intelligence. So you can actually understand Krishna is within your heart, and he's wanting to do this and that in this particular situation. And he's giving you the intelligence. And if you don't have that connection, then you have to get that connection. Always remember Krishna, never forget him. When you're actually remembering Krishna, then Krishna reminds you of his instructions. And then you'll be able to pray to actually execute those instructions. That's called abhideya, the activity of serving Krishna. And then the ultimate goal is actually love of God, because that's naturally what will be the conclusion of serving him, because he is completely lovable. He's the perfect friend, master, parent, or lover, whatever, he whatever we want him to be, he's the perfect receptacle for that affection. And everything that he does is perfect. So it's best to actually just surrender in any situation, and then we'll be safe. It's a straight and narrow path, and it's true that the only way you can, like my brother, he's an alcoholic, and I'm trying to help him, but sometimes people don't want to be helped. If they actually have the desire to be helped, then he may open up. He's also doesn't believe in this 12-step program, but I'm actually trying to introduce that program with veterans and also my brother, because Krishna consciousness is nothing but like depending on a higher power to conquer all these internal enemies. We have so many enemies, and we have so much dirt and garbage in our minds and hearts. It has to be cleansed. So if we're always constantly, directly, and perfectly executing whatever message Krishna is sending in the scripture, remembering those, churning those around and around in our mind, and chanting Hare Krishna, then we'll always be in touch, and we'll always be executing Krishna's will, and then serving Krishna, in the best way that we could possibly think of. What is his deepest desire? What will make him the most happy? That's the only aim of our life. And when we're actually, please Krishna, then there's nothing more to be attempted. There's nothing that's the highest goal, is to, haritoshanam, to please Krishna. So we're probably going to have to end here. This is a perfect time to end it, because it's 6:40 and it's the last verse of the third chapter. So,
the purport, right?
did we read it?
No.
We didn't read it. Okay. The third chapter of the Bhagavad-gītā is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness the ultimate end. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities of lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. Desiring for overlording and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and the intelligence. Why don't you just read the rest of it?
One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind, by steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, Philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. Thus ends
Yeah.
the Bhagavad-gītā purports to the 3rd chapter of the Srimad Bhagavad-gītā in the matter of karma yoga, or the discharge of one's prescribed duty in Krishna consciousness.
Yeah, it's all about using your discrimination, higher intelligence. Higher intelligence means coming from Krishna, not our own, mundane intelligence. All of our mental speculations are complete, will be complete failures, because Krishna is actually inconceivable. He's beyond our material conception, but he can reveal himself to us if we are open to his instruction. And as you surrender to him, he gives you more and more intelligence by which you can serve him and you can come to him. So the next chapter, let's see, what is it? I forgot. Transcendental knowledge. Okay, cool. We'll start on Wednesday with that. Thank you very
Sounds
much.
good. Thank you,
Hare
Shik.
Krishna.
Hare Krishna.